There you go. I call to order the December 21st meeting of the Governance and Policy Committee. Good morning, everyone. Let's turn to our agenda. Our first item of business today is to review the proposed policy amendments related to the board required reports. Executive Director Steves and Jason Langworthy, Board Associate Policy and Committees, are both here to walk us through the proposed amendments. So Mr. Steves, would you please start us off?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee, you'll recall that we talked about this topic previously, and today we're excited to bring back some recommendations for your consideration. Just as a starting point, I want to remind you that the Governance and Policy Committee, by policy, is charged with ensuring the high performance of the board and promoting effective governance by this body. And it's supposed to do that through ensuring that the conditions exist, so that it supports policies and practices of the board that help regents clarify the vision for the university, establish clear reserved and delegated authorities, develop performance measures for the university, and have opportunities for the board to consider risks. And so I think that I review that to start with because I believe that the policy or the changes that are being proposed today are squarely in that zone. They're squarely aligned with what this committee is charged with doing, which is elevating the effectiveness and performance of the board. So when we looked at board required reports, we were looking at them through a lens of three guiding principles that we spoke with you previously about. And that is that reports that support and enhance governance decisions or are about the university's strategic direction, they should be retained or enhanced or elevated in some way. Those that are primarily oversight mechanisms or whose frequency is maybe misaligned in some way, those we should look at and try to better align or to make them, I guess, tie them to the risk of the underlying activity. And then finally, the third guiding principle was that those reports that have modest strategic value or have maybe outlived their usefulness should be eliminated. And so we've gone through each of the reports and we have a number of recommendations. In total, the recommendations that we'll walk through today reduce the number, the overall number of required reports from 43 to 32, and they reduce the number of touch points or the number of times you see something in your docket from 57 to 32. And you'll note that the reason it ends up both at 32 is because we have had a number of situations where we have a report that's coming multiple times throughout a year. We've done all of this work in close coordination with the administration and with the impacted senior leaders. So what you're going to see is a set of recommendations that certainly is OBR's set of recommendations, but it's a set of recommendations that's endorsed by the administration and really supported by and we crafted them together with the administration. So Jason is going to walk through each of them and share them with you, and then we will be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Mr. Langworthy?
Chair Verhalen, members of the committee, good morning. I'm going to walk through on page 6 of the docket. I'm going to sort of put the changes into sort of categories, and we're going to start with the 4 new reports that merge current reports and add new information that will seek to support and enhance governance discussions, elevating the current reporting. So first, the Strategic Facilities and Real Estate Report combines current facility-related reporting and hopefully will help the board to track many of the facility-related concerns that were mentioned during yesterday's Finance and Operations Committee meeting. Next, the annual report on institutional risk and financial reports will give a broader view of compliance and institutional risk functions. The Workforce and HR Strategy Report merges the annual compensation report and the university health benefits report. Right now, those would come in separate meetings, and the report will also expand to a more holistic workforce and HR report, providing more opportunity, again, for the Finance and Operations Committee to talk through some of the items that were mentioned yesterday around compensation and workforce metrics. The annual report on the state of the university research enterprise, which, as you saw yesterday in mission fulfillment, would combine the report on commercialization of intellectual property and the report on the status of university research. All of these, the four that I just mentioned, expand from current oversight reporting to allow for more strategic topics that the board is interested in to be highlighted and expanded upon. So we'll give both the oversight and the metrics, and also provide more opportunity for those reports to dive deeper into strategic topics that the board may have mentioned or may be interested in, depending on sort of the cycle in which the report comes. Next, there are two reports that help to inform the development of either the operating or the capital budgets. First, the Central Reserves Fund report will now be a component of the annual operating budget, since the performance of the Central Reserves Fund and understanding how the fund performed is often helpful in forming the annual operating budget when you take review and action on that, typically in the spring. The Capital Finance and Debt Management report, which highlights the university's debt capacity, that will be aligned to come with the 6-year capital plan and the state capital request in the fall. Previously, this report would come oftentimes in February. So aligning it to the 6-year capital plan will help to inform that discussion as well. In alignment with the second principle, we're changing the following reports to annual reports, and those include the semi-annual institutional compliance report, the quarterly report of grant and contract activity, and the summary of expenditures for the Office of the President, East Cliff, and the Office of the Board of Regents. We are better aligning the path of the annual financial report to current practice and the committees that have oversight of that area, so to the Finance and Operations Committee and the Audit and Compliance Committee. Next, we're clarifying that the UMF audit plan, which provides a periodic compliance review of donated funds, is a component of the annual internal audit plan. The language right now in policy isn't clear, so we're going to clarify that, and that aligns with current practice. Finally, in alignment with the third principle, we are eliminating 4 reports or recommending elimination of 4 reports. That includes the annual investment performance peer comparisons. That peer information will be provided to the board, though, informally when it's released, and that sort of fluxes and changes and doesn't align with the other annual investment reports. So that's why we're shifting that and eliminating that sort of formal component. The other reports that we're recommending to be eliminated, the semi-annual management report and both the quarterly purchasing and asset management reports. And I'll just echo what Executive Director Steve said and add that all of the senior leaders that I spoke to were excited about the changes, and particularly shifting the reports to a more strategic focus, allowing them to align with MPAC 2025 goals and the University Progress Card, all while continuing to provide the necessary data for board oversight. And with that, Chair Verheugen, Executive Director and Steve's and myself would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Steves and Mr. Langworthy. Just as a reminder, this item is for discussion today. It's for a review. We'll return for action at a subsequent meeting. Before I ask if there's any other discussion, I did want to touch on 2 items, Chair's prerogative, I guess. The first is of the guiding principles that you discussed, Mr. Steves. One of them was modest strategic or oversight value, or those that have outlived their usefulness. I think I at least want to be really clear. It's not that we don't find the information in these necessarily helpful. It's that there have been other places where this information has been incorporated over the years. And so the specific reports identified under that are being elevated, or the content is being addressed elsewhere. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, largely yes. But what I'll say is that when you look across board policy, you'll see that it's really been an iterative process where information at various points in time, there's been an ad to create a report, or a new language to create a report, and they haven't necessarily connected to each other in a meaningful way. And so what we tried to do is we tried to look across all of them and think about the kinds of information that you would most need to govern and put forward a plan that holds together a little bit more coherently than the existing language does.
Thank you for that. We'll go to Regent Mayron first.
Thank you. Just a quick question. As I looked at the chart that was provided in our materials, the recommended changes to the board required reports, just to clarify what's listed here, and I counted basically about 11 of them, is these are the ones that are being recommended for change. It does not include all of the other reports that we will be retaining, the other 21. Is that correct?
Mr. Steves?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, that is correct. We only listed the ones where we are recommending changes. In your previous docket, we listed the entire list. So I think the October docket was that. We had the entire list.
Mr. Langworthy?
September.
September.
Thank
Yes,
you.
that's what I meant.
Thank you. Appreciate the clarification. That's the only question I had.
Okay. Any other regents have any questions, thoughts? I waited too long. Regent Powell?
Well, just a comment that, I mean, I think this is really good work. And I think that, combining one-off, sorts of reports into groupings that are more holistic and that allow for a more, a broader view of a topic is really positive. I think it'll help the board move from, in some cases, some tactical conversations to broader conversations that are more aligned with strategy. And I think that this structure will really support doing that. So, my view is, I think it's good work. Really grateful, for the diligence that went into, kind of thinking all of this through. And thank you.
And I think that's an item for all of us to think about as we go forward after this has been implemented and after we begin getting these reports, is to think through, is there anything that we further need to modify? This isn't that we're approving this and we can't look at it again for 15 years. This is an opportunity, as you said, to streamline things, to pull things together that more closely align to how we're, as a board, directing activity and how we're thinking about things through even things like MPAC 2025, the PEAK initiative, all of those pieces. And so if there are items as we go forward under this new proposed approach, to think through whether things may need to be augmented or we might want to ask to have additional items pulled forward to the board. Anything before we close out, Mr. Steves or Mr. Langworthy?
No additional comments.
All right, one last opportunity. Anything else from the regents? All right. Thank you for that discussion. So our next item is review of the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents policy namings. President Gable will walk us through the proposed amendments before we turn to questions or comments. President Gable, please proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Verhalen, Vice Chair Hipsch, and members of the committee. So this morning, we will discuss next steps in the board's namings policy, which is up for comprehensive review this year. This work is also part of our commitment to develop and enhance our understanding of our university's history, which we are sustaining beyond our recently completed April 2019 board charge. To help us in this work broadly, the university hired an institutional archivist who began this summer and a public historian onto the faculty who will begin this January. But before discussing how this all fits into our next steps, I'd like to briefly recap how we arrived at this point. So our recent campus dialogue around renamings began as a result of the groundbreaking project called A Campus Divided, which originally displayed at the Anderson Library in the fall of 2017, and then in the fall of 2018 at the Wilson Library. It brought forward evidence of anti-Semitism and racial discrimination at the university and served as a foundation for an MSA resolution and following presidential directive to call for an examination of the actions of 4 of our previous administrators. This led to a task force on building names and institutional history that undertook work that built historical research upon a framework designed by a previous working group called the President and Provost Advisory Committee on University History. These groups were comprised of faculty, staff, students, alumni, and community members, and represented all 5 University of Minnesota campuses. And the work focused on the role of these 4 senior administrators. They prepared a report which opened up a conversation over the purpose of namings and how the evolution of society's thinking should shape our process around namings. This question and this report was taken up by the board at their April 2019 meeting and resulted in a resolution directing the administration to, among other things, recommend revisions to the Board of Regents policy on namings and to establish in those recommendations principles and procedures to guide future renamings discussion. So upon my arrival in 2019 and over that academic year, we engaged in a lot of dialogue and consultation to address the board's charge. In October of 2019, during the Policy and Governance Committee meeting, we provided a timeline for consultation and a plan. And then in December 2019, we initiated the first of a three-part framework of presentations to establish revisions to the process. So many of you will recall we presented 4 existing renamings frameworks from 3 peer institutions, Yale, the University of Michigan, and Stanford, as well as the work I referred to earlier from the President and Provost Advisory Committee. Sometimes we refer to that report as the Coleman Committee report, so that we had some benchmarks. We also engaged in a discussion about how this emerging work across the country and the work we had previously done here could help us establish guiding principles, guide shared governance, help us develop a process, and a few other steps. Then in February of 2020 at the board meeting, we marked part 2 of this framework along the timeline. So we took in the continuous feedback from across our community and of course from all of you, and presented a draft policy for consideration that offered 5 guiding principles, 4 of which incorporated ideas from the Coleman Committee report. And then the last guiding principle on community and belonging came from the soon to be approved MPAC 2025 system-wide strategic plan. There we presented a series of factors to guide decision-making around a renaming or the revocation of a naming, which were largely adopted from the Stanford framework that we had discussed previously. The draft policy also went into who could make a request, how the request should be made and submitted, and the process for approval. So over the course of the spring semester, we then took that draft policy into broad formal and informal consultation across the system, which continued uninterrupted and had us on track to come back to this board at a subsequent board meeting. But as we all know, by the time we had the June 2020 meeting, we had experienced the tragedy of George Floyd's death, which led us to postpone this work for a variety of reasons, including the fact that those circumstances led many of us to reflect very differently on how all of this could be or should be. And in those months of reflection, including watching very closely what was happening at peer institutions across the country, including, I'll note, Princeton and Clemson in particular, that a lot of us in higher education have evaluated and reevaluated what it means to name a building, what it means to honor a historical figure, and what happens to that honor or might happen to that honor if the figure has a controversial past or a controversial and complicated legacy. And we've also used this time to do a lot of consultation about what it means for us in our community in particular. So all of that reflection and consultation brings us to where we are today, where we highlight something that actually, as complicated as all of this is rather simple, which is that if university namings and who we honor is a representation of us, of what we achieve, of our impact, of our progress, then our physical landscape of those buildings should evolve as we do. As we have new achievements, new people to honor, new progress, so should our landscape evolve to reflect that. So the challenge with that, in addition to the social challenges that we've been discussing, is that we have a fixed number of assets and we have a fixed number of naming opportunities across our campuses. And once someone is honored, in the past, those assets were no longer available to reflect who we are and to be an ongoing, evolving part of our landscape. So we proposed initially, post reflection period, that we add to the renamings policy that honorary namings should endure for a period of 100 years and then would sunset. And we've been referring to this as the sunset provision. The sunset provision is not a reflection of who was honored, but is a reflection of the passage of time and the passage of our own evolution and the idea that we should be able to move in new people who deserve to be honored as well. Consultation on that provision resulted in a lot of conversation, but really the only change that we heard consistently across constituencies was that 100 years was too long. And so in the policy proposal that we have before you, we've moved it to a 75-year horizon. This would impact university honorary namings prior to 1946. And across the system, this is just over 30 buildings. There are buildings on each campus that would be affected, except for Rochester, of course. I'll note for your consideration that in the draft proposal, namings associated with gifts or sponsorships would not apply to the 75-year duration because these are guided by contractual stipulations within the specific gift or sponsorship. So the way this is designed, the All University Honors Committee leads this work, as they do with virtually everything that reflects adding someone's name to something or anything that stewards how the university honors someone. So as we seek to review these namings, we are recommending as the administration that this work sits in the All University Honors Committee. So at the 75-year mark in the draft language, there are two potential areas for consideration for your discussion and review and input. The first is whether an honorary naming should be continued in perpetuity after its 75-year duration if the naming is deemed or the person honor is deemed so extraordinary, such an exemplar of the university's past, present, and future, and a reflection of the highest aspiration of institutional recognition, of our values, of our ideals, including the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, that their name should endure as we evolve amidst our ongoing achievement. If the university does not recommend a naming for continuation after the review, then they would review for a new name and make a recommendation up through the shared governance channels that the policy describes, which would ultimately come to this board for approval. I will mention for the board's consideration that the 75-year point and what happens there has been one of the most active areas of discussion amongst our constituency groups and something for us to sort of get our arms around, since you all would obviously be the ultimate decision makers around that point. So in addition to the sunset provision, we still have within the policy the language that was developed as a result of the review that led to the April 2019, which we have referred to as when someone is determined to have had a controversial past that may not, in the board's consideration, deserve to continue to be honored. This is totally separate from the sunset provision. It can happen anytime and is not tied to the duration of the naming, but rather to whether, upon review of the history or legacy of the person honored, the question is called as to whether the honor is deserved. This has an entirely different set of principles and factors around its renaming. This would occur when guiding principles that are in the draft policy around community and belonging, exceptionality, deliberation, and change, and then factors around impact on the university's goals, harm caused by retaining the name, harmful impact on the community are taken into consideration. If the review affirms a recommendation to the president to rename or revoke, the committee would then research and propose a new name, which promotes broad representation of the university's history and values. This also sits in the honors committee, and we believe this group is best positioned to do this work and leverage the expertise of our university community, but this work is advisory and comes up through shared governance ultimately to the board for their final review and approval. So we have been consulting this policy broadly across virtually every shared governance group. Informal consultation, we've done a lot of informal consultation. We've met with the Alumni Association, with the foundation, student government leadership, other governance groups. This draft policy reflects this important consultation and input. I will note that not everything everyone said they wanted is in the policy, but we have worked very hard to try to capture the spirit of what all of the different groups have presented as important to them. And we believe that what we have before you does so. I also want to note, because we haven't talked about this at length before, that there are some small changes in the policy around endowed chairs just to create consistency for the administration as they make that review. We do not consider these material changes, but we do want to call it to your attention. So at this time, Madam Chair, I'll stop and open the floor for questions and discussion if you wish.
Thank you very much, President Gable. Again, I'll note this item's for review. Today, we will take up voting on, or we'll take up action at a subsequent meeting. And before we start any discussion, to the last point you raised, President Gable, thank you for all of your work and your team's work in all of the consultation that's been done. I know when we first had this discussion back at our retreat in July, it was very important to this board that there be a lot of opportunities for input from the university community, university stakeholders, and really appreciate the time and effort that has gone into those opportunities. And so at this point, I will ask the regents to let us know if you'd like to say anything or have any questions, but we'll start with Regent Mayron.
Thank you. Thank you, President Gable, for bringing this to us. We have made great strides since we started on this shortly after I became a regent. At that time, we were focusing on renamings, and now with this comprehensive review, all of the work that you and your office has done and consultation, I think is terrific. I've gone through this in great detail. I did provide actually written comments to Mr. Steves, and they will be available for the governance committee to review. Some of them are what I would call scrivening matters, but what I wanted to address are the more conceptual or policy matters behind this comprehensive policy that we're now addressing on namings and renamings. My first comment my first concern is that while I think we have done an excellent job now in setting out the criteria for renamings and addressing the sunset provision for honorary namings, I believe that we need to set out criteria that the appropriate committee, whether it's the honorary committee or whoever, will address when they are asked for a naming, when they are addressing gifts and sponsorships, and when they are asked to review namings in the event that there is a request for retention after the 75 years. And if it is rejected, then the opportunity comes up at that point for renaming a building at that point. When I review this policy, I cannot find any criteria that sets out what the reviewing or evaluating committee should be doing when asked to name. A request is made for an honorary naming of a building. There are no criteria set out for gifts or sponsorships, and none set out in the event that a request for retention of a name is rejected and a building which exists will be renamed. I think it is critical that this board set forth in its policy the criteria for which the evaluating committees should be using. And in fact, I recall a conversation I had earlier, I think it was this year, back in the summer with the individual who manages the whole naming process. And one of the things that she identified, the difficulty that they have as a committee, is they don't know what criteria to apply when a request for a naming has occurred for an honorary naming. So I think that needs to be addressed. It needs to be integrated and consistent with what we are doing with the criteria for renaming. I don't think we should be asking these evaluating committees to guess as to what is the appropriate criteria to apply. I recognize it may be difficult to articulate, but I think it should be the board that articulates it in its policy and not leaving others to guess who are implementing our policies. So I think that that is something we absolutely need to address. The second item has to do with the gifts and sponsorships. I understand the 75-year sunset provision is not applying in this proposed policy, and I would ask, why not? Why wouldn't it be? I understand that at times the contracts with gifts do set out how long a building or an honorary naming will take place, but I also understand that many contracts do not address the time. I think we need to address that in our policy as to at least what the outside time period would be for a gift that results in the naming of a building as well. I don't think it should be confined just to honorary namings. The third item has to do, I think, with clarifying the sunset provision to this extent. I think the way it currently reads is that every building which is 75, hits the 75-year mark, will be up for review as to whether the name should be retained. And my view would be it should only be up for review if somebody requests that it be retained, whether it's the president or the board or a member of the university or community or anyone who might make that request. But I don't think we should be going through the exercise of reviewing every building that it comes, that hits the 75-year mark, but only those buildings in which an interest has been expressed that the retention should continue on beyond 75 years. And I think that what should apply actually to the buildings. I think President Gable, you identified there are maybe 30 some buildings that would be up for review under this current provision that were put in place in the 1940s or before. I honestly think the review should only take place for those that there is a request made for retention. And the last issue it's more of a question to understand why we're doing it this way. With respect to honorary namings, my understanding is an honorary naming cannot be of a person who is still somehow employed by or associated with the university. They had to have left the university. They can be alive, but they have to have left the university. But interestingly, as I look at what we've done with gifts and sponsorships, it does not appear we have that same requirement. So I'm not sure actually which way to go on it, because I'm not understanding at this point why way back when in the earlier version of this policy, someone thought it was important that honorary namings could only be of individuals who were no longer with the university. So if maybe a better understanding of that underlying policy would lead us to decide which direction to go. But I do think it's important that we be consistent among honorary namings with gifts and sponsorships. So those are my input and my comments. As I said, I did have some other more scrivening type things, but the board office can provide that to the governance committee for review when we look at the next iteration of this policy. Thank you.
President Gable, did you want to address any of those items at the outset, particularly given your detailed conversations with a lot of different stakeholders?
Yes, absolutely. So, but thank you, Madam Chair. And I really want to thank Regent Mayron, who of course is the previous chair of this committee, who has been the angel on our shoulders through this entire process in order to do something that's really a critical fork in the road moment, arguably for the university, in the best possible way. So I want to offer my personal thanks to Regent Mayron and of course everyone else who consulted, but I'm sure as you can see by her question, the extent to which she's been involved as a partner in this process. So just a few thoughts on each of these questions or concerns, because of course, as they come to this point in the process, we're at the point where this is largely where the board would make its own decision about what this policy should or shouldn't contain. And I can simply sort of synthesize what the consultative conversations have been at this part. So in reflecting those conversations, with regard to the level of degree around criteria for honorary namings, the All University Honors Committee would normally and traditionally set their own criteria for how they do their own work. And then through those criteria would be known and publicly available. And if they're doing their job correctly, which they, in my observation, always do, they would seek your input in the development of that criteria, but they wouldn't have their criteria dictated to them by the board. That would be different than how we normally do it. There's nothing that prohibits it, but it would be different from the more typical shared governance process where those doing the sort of widest part of the funnel review would develop their own criteria. With regard to gifts and sponsorships versus honorary namings, the this is a very active point of discussion through the consultative process. And the question that Regent Mayron is calling is reflective of a pretty wide spectrum of discussion around that question. And it's really ultimately the recommendation of the administration, but up to this board, whether you see that there's a difference both in content and in procedure between those who we name because they've done something for the university in their work or in their achievement versus those who where the naming reflects their philanthropy. It's in the opinion of the administration, two different things, but that is something that can be decided ultimately by this group. But with regard to the need for an affirmative request or some sort of step in the process, if a building that hits 75 years should get, needs to be affirmatively triggered by a request. I mean, we're agnostic. That's the Regent Mayron's suggestion around this is the first we've heard of it, but in my reflection on all the conversations we've had, I don't see any group that would be particularly concerned, nor with the fourth point around other attributes of the policy. So in the first two, there's been wider discussion. What you have before you is how the administration fell on those two issues, but ultimately we will very happily work with whatever is in the collective wisdom of the board.
May I make a or ask President Gable a question on the consultative process?
Sure, go ahead, Regent Mayron.
Thank you, Chair. President Gable, on the, did it come up in discussions with those that were consulted about why a person would have to leave in order to do an honorary naming versus those that are buildings or whatever that are named for philanthropic purposes as a result of a gift or a sponsorship? You know, I think about various, we have, well, I'll leave it with that. Was there any discussion on that issue, or do you have any opinion or thoughts on that?
It did not come up in any of the discussions that I personally participated in, and I'm checking my phone because, of course, various colleagues who were in different discussions to see if anybody pinged me, and nobody did. So I'm not sure if it's because there was a focus on like the bigger fish in the basket and how to fry them. But I do know just from my own personal and professional experience that this varies from campus to campus. I mean, my alma mater recently named something for the sitting president just last year. And then other places have the same standard we do. I think there are arguments in both directions for how that would work. But it is historically what we've done here. And so it did not receive the attention that your question puts upon it.
Thank you. And we do have two other regents who identified they wanted to speak right at the beginning of this discussion, but Regent Powell, I noticed you asked to speak. Was it specific to this issue or just to be added to the queue?
It's specific to the points that Regent Mayron has made, but I can wait.
Okay. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. And speaking, we've got a couple different thoughts here, but speaking to the points that are in front of us, I think Regent Mayron makes excellent points. And I also have a couple Scrivener questions, but like her, I will wait for in between our meetings to do that. But on the specific points, I would advocate, or I would support her advocacy for having some level of standard for the Honors Committee in Regents policy. I think that from the exercise and the application of those standards, I think we meet the shared governance concept very well. But I also think that we can have, you know, for 75-year decisions, you can have some vastly different standards between people who are turning over within the Honors Committee setting. And so I think having some level of criteria that the board has for expectation, I think it will keep the Honors Committee and the board sort of on the same azimuth as you know, making these decisions. And so I think that, you know, I don't know that it has to necessarily be that precise, but at least some guiding principles for what the expectations are for, especially for building names. I think that would be very helpful. But speaking on the 75-year, at the 75-year mark, in the policy, the language said, and I wasn't real clear what it meant. It says the Honors Committee may consider retention 3 years before or after the naming 75th year. And so I didn't know if that converts it into a 78-year naming, or I just wasn't real clear on that. But what to me, what would make more sense, and I think would be more dignified for the people whose names and legacies are in consideration, wouldn't be to have a specific process for reconsideration of retention. I would much rather see that sometime in maybe the 3 years leading up to the 75 years, the Honors Committee starts considering what the naming will be at the end of the 75th year. If the incumbent name is renominated, they would be part of a consideration, but not a separate decision to say, is this person worthy of retention? Because that comes with a stigma that if you decide not to retain the name, it's almost as if it's an insult to the individual legacy. Whereas if they simply are eligible to be placed in the consideration among other people that would be considered for that honor, I don't think it makes a huge difference in the way this thing lays out, but I would just simply say that 3 years prior to the 75th year, the Honors Committee shall start considering for the name at the conclusion of that time, and that the incumbent name may be considered for continuation, but not a specific determination whether it should be retained or not. Because again, a negative decision about retention, kind of puts a focus on that the committee didn't think this person was worthy, as opposed to simply they weren't renamed and some other person was put forward and brought forward. So I'll subject, allowing Regent Powell to address the points in place right now. I may have a couple comments after that, if that's okay, Madam Chair.
Okay. President Gable, did you want to address the question about the 75 years? I saw that as an attempt to address the concern that we discussed at our prior meeting about if too many buildings are up at 75 years, it's more of a bandwidth to
Yes.
address that. But if there's confusion about that, I would appreciate your perspective and clarification.
Yes, no, that's exactly right, Madam Chair and Regent Rocha. Just that the 3 year before or after was intended to create a bandwidth capacity, particularly at the beginning, and also to give time for a pipeline of new names to be developed, because this doesn't exist right now. So, and we, you want to, in a very thoughtful and purposeful way, identify whose names would start to appear on the buildings in the future. So that area needing some attention does not surprise me.
Any follow-up on that? Regent Rocha?
No, thank you.
Okay. Are you okay waiting one more person? Regent Powell, Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. And I have what's probably a very basic policy question for Director Steves or Jason, and it relates to the issue of criteria. And President Gable, I think you partly answered my question, but when we look at policy, that's the stable piece guiding operations. And then there's an operational piece to policy that maybe codifies that operational side, in which this case, the Honors Committee would come up with the criteria in consultation as well. And therefore, in my view, it does not need to be in the policy itself, because the criteria, as Regent Rocha reflected, people change, but the criteria could change too. And then those changes are on the operational side that then the board is involved in, but not in the policy itself. Is that, I know we can do whatever we want, but typically, is that how policy works?
Executive Director Steves.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, generally, yes, that the board policy sets the broad parameters and the broad direction that you want to have the university operate within, and then specific procedures or specific criterion or other things of that nature end up being delegated to the administration in some way, and then that is established through either an administrative policy process or procedures or other things of that nature. So I think that is fairly typical in terms of a broad construct. Yeah.
So any follow-up?
Chair Verhalen, so therefore, my view, I'll just state again, would be that the Honors Committee plays that procedural role following our policy framework. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for being very patient, Regent Powell.
So thank you, Chair Verhalen. And I also want to thank the committee and Regent Mayron and the president for the work that's been done in this policy. I think it's come a long way. I really think that you guys have served us well. It gets better and better and better. And I think that in general, I'll just speak for myself, feel really, really good about where we've got this to. There's still some more work to do, but gosh, we've come a long way. And I think it also shows the positive impact of all the shared governance and consultation. I think everyone who's had a look at this has helped it. So I wanted to just I also very much appreciate Regent Mayron's comments, and I'm a little bit perplexed on the criteria question, which I think is a really good question and a challenging one. But the way I thought of this is, first of all, each of these, thinking about the committee doing the work, I mean, each case that they consider is going to be very challenging and very unique. I mean, because each one of these is the story of someone's life. So it's going to be, each one will be a totally unique narrative that they're trying to decide. But as I thought about it, and they're going to have flexibility to think through that. I think that's essential. But as I looked at the guiding principles that lead this off, I took those as the criterion. And so I may be misunderstanding, where we're trying to get to. But when I think about the criteria of, do they reflect our community? Would this renaming really help us to advance our history? And then a really critical one, exceptionality. Is this really an exceptional person, with a number of reference points to help us decide about exceptionality, alignment with the mission and code of conduct and our values? I mean, do they fit, in there? And then, the challenge that this is really a serious deliberative process. I mean, my takeaway from that is that those requirements and principles would certainly put the committee, I think, in a place that I would be comfortable with. And they'd have plenty of touch points. And then beyond that, I think we got to let the committee do their work. And because again, each of these stories is going to be very individual. But and as a board coming back, if they coming to us with a recommendation, I think we'd have plenty of ways to, if you will, check boxes. Are they really advancing a history? Are they really consistent? Are they really exceptional? And it's going to be highly qualitative by definition. But my view is that there's enough in these principles to guide us. Anyway, so that's the thought. The other very tactical question I have is, when we reconsider, is the notion that we would reconsider for another 75 years or in perpetuity or for 4 years? Or, I mean, is there some sort of, should we be more specific about what, if we extend, how long? Anyway, those are my comments.
Thank you, Regent Powell. President Gabel, would you like to?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regent Powell, that was also a topic of discussion across various consultations. Some who thought there should be one gate, and then after that it would be in perpetuity. Some who suggested that after 75 years it would go into a rolling every however many years review. And some who thought it should be 75 years and then another 75 years. There are pros and cons to each of those. The administration, I think where we fell, and I'm looking to my colleague, was one gate and then it's over. From the administrative point of view, it would be one gate and then it's over. But those, meaning the name would be for as long as the building stands. But those are the sorts of options that emerged through the consultative process.
Any follow-up, Regent Powell?
Nope.
To that point, President Gabel, the concept of one gate and then it's over would not preclude, if new information were come to light, if there were a change in overall policy, et cetera, that name could still be revisited and renamed as necessary, consistent with the university's guiding principles.
Yes, absolutely, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Regent Mayron?
Yes, thank you. I just want to speak again to the issue of the criteria. I think it is incredibly important for this board to set the guidelines and guideposts for the honors committee or whatever committee is considering the issue. Obviously, they will implement it, but I think leaving it to them to sort out what the criteria should be. And in light of Regent Roche's, I think, excellent point that the members of that committee will change, I don't think is a good way to govern. And in fact, Chair Powell, I think you began to articulate criteria that we could set forth in this policy for them to consider. And some of it is actually reversing what we did when we think about criteria for whether to revoke a naming, advancement of the university's mission, guiding principles, and shared history, impact on the university's diversity and equity and inclusion goals, the strength of the information that's coming to the committee to support them, making sure that they are gathering information about this individual from a variety of sources, either within the university or outside the university. I think part of the reason for setting out the criteria at the front end is that hopefully the excellent work of the implementing committee, the honors committee, will address issues that perhaps will never get us to a situation again where we have to entertain a request for renaming because of behavior that did not percolate to the surface at the time because the appropriate questions were not asked at the time, or the appropriate people were not sought for information. So I think it is critical that we set out the criteria and the guardrails for the honors committee as to the kinds of information they should obtain. And then they have the flexibility to frame the issue with respect to their recommendation to us. But I don't think we should be leaving it to that committee to sort it out for us. And again, I just want to reflect that the conversation I had this summer is that the difficulty that the committee, the honors committee, was having with requests for namings because they didn't know what criteria to apply. They were waiting to hear what the policy was going to be from this board. And I don't think they should have to be in that position. I think we can set that out. And if that means combining some of the criteria or factors that are in the renamings and some of the guiding principles that are at the beginning, I think we can do it and give them the tools that they need to evaluate a request for naming. And I'm interested also from my colleagues what you think about whether gifts and sponsorships should be treated differently. I would be comfortable saying that a gift or sponsorship could be by contract up to, but not to exceed 75 years. But I think the same issue having to deal with finite gifts or finite assets, whether they're the subject of a gift or an honorary naming, I think that permeates all of our buildings, and I think they should be treated the same way, whether they come to us from a philanthropic gift or an honorary naming by us.
Thank you, Regent Mayron. Before I go back to you, Regent Powell, because I know you wanted to respond directly to that, I personally hesitate to add additional criteria to this policy. Instead, I would prefer to see language that says it's the expectation that the honors committee develops the criteria that will be used in line with the guiding principles and directives of this policy. And that those policies or those specific criteria could be reviewed by this board, and we could review them on a set a review basis to ensure that they continue to be used in line with this policy. But I hesitate to go to the point of setting the criteria. And I think one of the items you just said, Regent Mayron, really struck me, which was the committee's concern was they were waiting for directive from this board on our policy. Well, this is our policy, and these are our directives, and these are our guardrails as to how namings, renamings, retention of namings should occur on a going forward basis. And that's how I see the different pieces of this particular puzzle fitting together. Regent Powell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. So really, I want to respond by asking two questions. And the first one is a comment and a question. The first one is, how do we feel about these guiding principles? Do we feel that they start to stake out the criteria and the way that we as a board would evaluate a namings recommendation? My own view is, I think they are pretty good. I think they make a good start. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be strengthened or improved or modified, but I think they're good. That's the first question or first point. But the second one is to more, squarely to Regent Mayron's point. My assumption was that that this is the policy, and these would have the force of criteria for, that the committee, the naming committee we are basically obligating them to use these principles as they go through their deliberation, so that they do in fact have if they don't, then that's a problem for me. Because I do think we need to have, there needs to be a framework. So I guess the question is maybe to you, Mr. Steves, is would these principles, address the sort of criteria challenge that Regent Mayron is raising?
Executive Director Steves.
Madam Chair, Regent Powell, and members of the committee, I actually do believe you're making a really good point. I think that the guiding principles absolutely would have the ability to, and would kind of be enforced to guide all decisions made under the policy. One possibility would be even to cross-reference the guiding principles, later in the policy when you're talking about namings considerations. You could simply refer back to the guiding principles to maybe even further reinforce the desire to have those inform and guide the work of the committee. That could be potentially a small change, but it wouldn't necessarily change the substance of the policy.
Thank you. Regent Rosha.
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. Yeah, I think that there's been a good discussion about that, and the guiding principles are, you can see as a bit of a guidepost. I think there's a bit more specificity than in the renaming part, and you can almost say, well, just flip those on their head and say, well, these can't be the harm, that these have to be a positive criteria. But I suspect we can continue that dialogue. Just a few points kind of off of this a little bit as we do look into the renaming part, which I think is really kind of the groundbreaking part of this policy. And just like with the naming side, I think the more kind of clarity we can provide to the honors committee as far as where the board sits and the expectations, the more likely we'll remain aligned in the process of these fairly significant considerations. One of them is that I think that it would be beneficial to have in the policy that these decisions or these considerations for renaming would be conducted one at a time. For those that went through the process a few years ago here, the fact that there were 4 in the same document, I think became a bit of a challenge, because you started to have some kind of overspray from one party's historical record into the other folks. And I think that the folks that are being evaluated oftentimes many years after, and certainly not here to represent their own legacy, having them considered one at a time, I think is very important to ensure a fair and comprehensive process. Second, I think it would be appropriate to have language in the criteria that provides that this process of reconsideration of naming would be with recognition of the historical context. Obviously, in many of these cases, people have been gone for many years. And even now, we can see within the last 20 years, there are people that are on the public stage that have had major evolutions in their thinking. And if you take that from a historical context, if you stop it in time, it's a different evaluation than if a person has the opportunity to evolve with changing mores and standards. And so I think that it should at least recognize that there are historical contexts and that society changes, and that in this evaluation that we have the respect for people that they didn't have the opportunity to make that evolution. next, I think that there's, if you ask the question right now, which naming on campus is an issue? Which one right now is a problem? And if you ask most people, they say, well, I don't know. And so one of the I think it would be valuable to have a point in here that the actual effort or petition for a reconsideration should not be the source of the discomfort, because the petition itself ends up creating the problem, creates the controversy. And so when you put a policy like this in place, to some extent, you almost invite the controversy. And so I think that it would be appropriate to have in here that the petition for reconsideration should not be the source of the impairment or of the controversy. And then finally, there's some pretty specific language in here, and you go into C under the review of factors for renaming or revocation. And again, we have very specific factors in this part of the policy if we don't have specific factors in the namings part. But when it talks about, it says, to the extent that retaining a name creates an environment that impairs the ability of students, faculty, or staff of a particular gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, national origin, or other characteristic protected by federal law or university policy to participate fully and effectively in the university's mission. That's remarkably subjective. And when you talk about naming buildings after people who've had public lives, you're almost certainly going to have some portion of the population that is a strong advocate for the person, and other people that may find it to be problematic to do that. And so I think at a minimum, it should be substantially impairs. We should make it clear that it has to be more than a disagreement with some aspect of that individual's participation in public life, if it is somebody who has been a part of public life. And so, I could certainly give you examples where a small group of people with a specific and deeply held belief might find people that the majority of people are comfortable with. And so I'm just trying to look for future boards, look out for future boards opportunities that aren't facing, challenge after challenge to namings based on some again, appropriate, clearly deeply held concerns about some aspect of somebody's background, but one that wouldn't truly prevent them from accessing the value of the University of Minnesota. Those are my comments, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent Hipsch?
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. I tend to agree on the criteria question, that the guiding principles are given the direction to the committee, and the committee come up with the actual criteria. I think that's really smart because of the uniqueness of each building and the uniqueness of each person. And the final say on if the naming is, if the building is named, it comes to this board anyway. So they're going to have to give their argument to this board on whether or not they want the building named. Secondly, I tend to agree with Regent Rocha on the 75-year question. It was a little confusing for me from the, is it 75 or 78? I thought the same thing. So I'd like to have it done by 75 years. So it's a cutoff date. And I think all buildings should be considered so nobody feels bad about that. And then on Regent Mayron's question about gift giving and buildings named after gifts, I don't know what I don't know right now. I don't know how that would affect giving. I think that some people would tend to want a perpetuity gift. They'd give a larger gift for perpetuity reasons versus a 75-year gift. And so before we do anything there, I would want to hear from the foundation and other people that are a lot smarter than I am about what that does to our donations. So I don't disagree with it. I just don't know. So so that's where I'm at on this policy. I like the policy in general. I think it's very good. I think it does what we want it to do. So thank you.
Thank you. Regent Farnsworth?
Thank you, Chair Verhalen. And I'm going to loop back just briefly to a few things because the conversation has moved a little bit since I jumped in queue, but in a good way. And I've really been enjoying listening to what colleagues think about this and find the dialogue immensely helpful. 2 points, one on criteria. I had the same reading that Regent Powell did in terms of the guiding principles, and I'm hoping that was kind of, at least on the onset, what to Regent Mayron's concern would be connected to the criteria question. I would agree that I think, these guiding principles in here are well articulated, would hope that that would help frame the committee's work to create criteria. And I know since we're talking about this for review today, it would be great to hear some, not necessarily that we need to see a full-fleshed criteria done, because that doesn't really make a ton of sense in the fact that this, how this policy or proposed policy is moving, but it would be great to see that, to your point, Chair Verhalen, back here at some point, so we can kind of see, ensure that things are aligning and we have that full understanding. The second point about Regent Mayron's concern about gifts and sponsorships, I would agree with what Regent Hipsch just said about wanting to hear more from the foundation on that. I certainly am not an expert in that area either, and would love to hear some more analysis, particularly from them about potential, consequences, ramifications for going one way or another. Would tend to agree with Regent Mayron that some consistency there makes sense between gifts and sponsorships and the other namings process. But I don't know what I don't know either. So well said on that. And then just wanted to thank President Gable and the team for this, as having been around in a different spot or in a different position in 2019, to hear, as Regent Powell was talking about, this has come a substantial way, and there's still more work to be done. But really appreciate everyone who's worked on this and has been part of the consultation process and tackled a lot of these really tough issues that I'm looking forward to settling that here as we get into the new year and having a really good policy to move forward on. So those are my few comments with the criteria piece and the consistency piece, and agree from a governance standpoint that it makes sense for us to get this policy as clear as possible in terms of that criteria, and in response to the consultation that Regent Mayron has been involved in, clarify that for the namings committee. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Farnsworth. Any additional comments from the regents or questions at this time? Any additional comments from the president at this time? Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you. Anything on Zoom? Sorry, no. Okay. I really want to thank all of you for your time and effort in reviewing this. I want to thank again President Gable, you, your staff, everyone who was willing to sit down and discuss their concerns, their comments, their thoughts with you, and the work that went into incorporating it into what is in front of us. I think we have some really good feedback that we've received, some additional follow-up that needs to happen. And then we'll bring this back to the board for action at a future date. There being no additional business before this committee, we stand adjourned for 15 minutes. Which means the board will reconvene at about 9:25, if I'm doing my math correctly. So thank you everyone for your time today.